Have you been waking at exactly 3:47 a.m.? Heart racing, mind spinning, wondering if you're losing your sanity? What if I told you that this precise, relentless awakening isn't your enemy but your invitation? A recent sleep study revealed that 73% of women over 50 wake between 3 and 4 a.m. But here's what science can't explain. Why do thousands wake at exactly 3:47, not 3:45, not 3:50, but 3:47 a.m., every single night? For 6 weeks straight, Eleanor Mitchell, a 58-year-old retired nurse from a small town in Iowa, fought against these mysterious awakenings. She tried everything: medication, meditation, expensive sleep aids. Nothing worked, until the night she stopped fighting and discovered something that changed everything. God wasn't stealing her rest, He was calling her deeper. This isn't another story about insomnia or anxiety. This is about the sacred disruption that thousands of women over 50 are experiencing right now. That precise wake-up call that seems like disorder but is actually divine appointment. It's about discovering soul flowing in the last place you'd expect to find it, in the middle of the night. When the world sleeps and heaven bends close, the digital clock cast its green glow across Eleanor's nightstand, those numbers burning into her retinas like a brand she couldn't escape. For 6 weeks straight, her eyes would snap open at exactly 3:47 a.m. Her heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt too small. Her small Iowa town slept peacefully outside her window, but inside her bedroom, a different kind of awakening was taking place. She'd tried everything: melatonin, white noise machines, even those expensive blackout curtains her daughter had sent from California. But nothing could stop this precise, relentless awakening. The house felt different at 3:47, not just quiet, but expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. At first, Eleanor blamed grief. 3 months since she'd buried her mother, 3 months since those caregiving nights had ended, and now her body refused to forget its vigil schedule. But this felt different from those exhausted 2 a.m. medication checks. This felt intentional. The precision haunted her. Not 3:45, not 3:50, always 3:47, as if someone had set an alarm in her soul. Eleanor's hands would tremble as she reached for the bedside lamp, but she never turned it on. Light felt too harsh, too real for whatever was happening in these suspended moments. Her throat would constrict, dry as August pavement. While her mind raced through its catalog of worries, unpaid bills, her brother's drinking, that strange pain in her left shoulder, that WebMD said could be anything from stress to cardiac arrest. The darkness pressed against her like a living thing. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, feel the sheets growing damp with perspiration that had nothing to do with temperature. 58 years old, and she felt like a child again, afraid of monsters that logic insisted didn't exist. Some nights, she'd grip her mother's rosary so tight the beads left marks on her palms. Other nights, she'd simply lie frozen, counting heartbeats, waiting for dawn like a prisoner counting days. The fear wasn't just about being awake, it was about being alone with something she couldn't name, couldn't fight, couldn't medicate away. Her doctor had called it adjustment insomnia. Her therapist suggested complicated grief, but Eleanor knew diagnoses couldn't explain why every fiber of her being felt electrically alive at exactly 3:47. Why the air itself seemed to thicken with presence. The question arrived on a Tuesday night, slipping into Eleanor's consciousness like moonlight through curtains. She'd been awake for 12 minutes, watching 3:47 turn to 3:59. When the thought landed soft as a feather, what if this isn't something wrong with me? Her rational mind immediately protested. Of course it was anxiety, post-caregiving trauma, hormonal shifts. Any psychiatrist would have a perfectly logical explanation for why her brain chose this ungodly hour to rehearse every mistake she'd ever made since 3rd grade. But underneath the clinical explanations, something else whispered. The consistency felt too deliberate, the timing too precise. Even the quality of the wakefulness, not groggy or confused, but sharp, clear, almost expectant. Eleanor remembered her grandmother's stories about the thin bird hours, Those pre-dawn moments when heaven bent closer to earth, she'd dismissed them as old country superstition. The kind of folklore that didn't survive nursing school's scientific rigor. Yet here she sat, medical training useless against whatever pulled her from sleep with clockwork precision. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, pregnant with something she couldn't quite perceive. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Eleanor wondered if she'd been asking the wrong questions entirely. Thursday, 3:42 a.m. Eleanor lay awake, watching the minutes tick toward the inevitable. But tonight, exhaustion had carved something loose inside her. When 3:47 arrived with its familiar jolt of adrenaline, she didn't reach for her phone. Didn't start her breathing exercises. Didn't fight. "Fine," she whispered to the darkness, her voice cracking like old leather. "You win. Whatever you are, you win." The surrender felt like stepping off a cliff. Her body went limp against the mattress, hands unclenched for the first time in weeks. The racing thoughts slowed, then stilled, like a record player winding down. And in that stillness, something extraordinary happened. That's when she heard it. Not with her ears, but deeper. 3 words, clear as crystal. "I see you." Eleanor's eyes flew open. She was alone in the room, but had never felt less alone in her life. The fear didn't disappear, it transformed. Like ice melting into water, the panic softened into something else entirely. Presence, not threatening, but waiting. As if the universe had been knocking on her door for 6 weeks, and she'd finally stopped deadbolting it shut. Eleanor's breath deepened without effort. Her heartbeat found a rhythm that felt ancient, primal, right. She wasn't falling back asleep, but she wasn't fighting wakefulness either. She was simply there. Present in the darkness that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a cathedral. The clock read 3:52 when she finally opened her eyes. 5 minutes had passed. 5 minutes that felt like crossing from one life into another. Eleanor pulled her mother's Bible from the nightstand drawer, its pages soft as tissue from decades of handling. She'd never been one for midnight scripture reading, but something drew her fingers to the Psalms, 2 verses she'd heard but never truly understood. "I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night my heart instructs me." Psalm 16-7. The words seemed to pulse with new meaning. Even at night, not despite the night, but through it. She found more. The 4th watch, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., when Jesus walked on water. When divine breakthroughs happened in Scripture's darkest hours. Samuel, awakened 3 times before recognizing God's voice. Jacob, wrestling with angels until dawn. Her nursing brain had always preferred daylight faith, practical and measurable. But here in the pages, she discovered a God who specialized in night shifts, who used darkness not as punishment but as meeting ground. The biblical pattern was unmistakable. Transformation happened when the world slept. Mark 1:35 stopped her cold. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place, where he prayed. Still dark. Not fighting for more sleep, but rising to meet something that couldn't be found in daylight's noise. Eleanor's 3:47 wakening suddenly felt less like affliction and more like ancient invitation. The next 3:47 arrival found Eleanor prepared, not with defenses, but with curiosity. She let the wakefulness wash over her like a tide, neither advancing nor retreating, just receiving. In the profound quiet of her Iowa bedroom, she began to notice things. The refrigerator's hum 2 rooms away. A train's distant whistle, the house settling into its foundations with small, comforting sighs. And underneath it all, something else. Not a sound exactly, but a frequency, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the silence itself. No burning bush, no thunderous voice. Just this gentle, persistent awareness that she wasn't alone. The presence she'd feared was actually companionship, patient as morning, waiting for her to stop drowning it out with anxiety's static. Eleanor found herself breathing words into the darkness, not formal prayers, but fragments of honesty. "I miss her. I'm scared of being unnecessary. I don't know who I am without someone to take care of." Each admission, fell into the silence like seeds into soil, received without judgment. The stillness held her confessions without trying to fix them. And in that holding, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since before her mother's illness: spaciousness. Room to exist without performing, without proving, without pushing. Just being, at 3:47 a.m., with whatever was keeping watch. 2 weeks into her new surrender, Eleanor understood. These awakenings weren't disruptions, they were invitations written in the language of interrupted sleep. God wasn't stealing her rest. He was offering her something REM cycles couldn't provide. She thought of all the invitations she'd missed while busy being productive. The sunset she'd rushed past while checking medications. The cardinal that tapped at her mother's window during those final weeks, ignored because death demanded all her attention. Now, at 3:47 a.m., came an invitation that wouldn't be ignored. It arrived, dressed as insomnia, but revealed itself as intimacy. The divine appointment keeper had chosen the only hour Eleanor couldn't fill with tasks, couldn't multitask through, couldn't delegate or postpone. This wasn't punishment for an overscheduled life, it was rescue from it. The invitation read simply, "Stop managing, start receiving." Eleanor realized she'd spent 3 years managing her mother's decline, 5 years before that managing her father's, and decades managing everyone else's needs in hospital corridors. But here, in the cathedral of 3:47 a.m., there was nothing to manage. Only an invitation to be held by something infinitely larger than her next crisis. She whispered yes into the darkness, and felt something inside her unclench that had been fisted tight since she was 23, and decided she had to save everyone. Eleanor discovered it by accident, or perhaps by design. One night, instead of lying rigid in bed, she let her body move with the wakefulness, sitting up, standing, walking to the window, not forcing movement, but following what wanted to happen. Her feet found their way to the kitchen, hands reaching for her grandmother's teacup without thought. The movements felt choreographed by something beyond her planning mind. Water into kettle, kettle onto stove, each action flowing into the next, without the usual mental commentary about efficiency or purpose. This wasn't the grinding productivity she'd perfected during nursing shifts, checking off tasks, managing time, pushing through exhaustion. This was something entirely different. Movement without strain, action without force, like a river that knows its way to the sea without consulting a map. Standing at the window, tea warming her palms, Eleanor watched snow fall on her sleeping Iowa town and understood. She'd discovered soul flowing, not through a book or workshop, but through stopping her fight against divine timing. The difference was visceral. Grinding felt like machinery, gears turning, metal on metal, wearing down with each rotation. But this felt like dancing with a partner who knew every step, who could lead if she'd just stop counting beats and trust the music. Eleanor learned to distinguish between the mind's chatter and the soul's whisper. At 3:47, both were audible, but they spoke different languages entirely. The mind spoke in shoulds and lists, even at this ungodly hour. Should go back to sleep. Should meal prep tomorrow. Should call Jennifer about mom's jewelry. It was the voice she'd obeyed for 58 years. The taskmaster that had made her an excellent nurse and exhausted woman. But underneath, barely audible at first, came something else. Not words exactly, but knowings. A gentle pull toward the journal she'd bought, but never opened. An urge to light the candle her sister sent from Sedona. A desire to simply sit with her hands open, palms up, receiving nothing and everything. She stopped trying to manufacture spiritual experiences. No more forcing herself to pray formal prayers or squinting for visions. Instead, she became quietly available, like a radio tuned to a frequency only darkness could reveal. Some nights she received single words: rest, trust, release. Other nights, just the sensation of being held by something vast and tender. She wrote nothing down, analyzed nothing, just let the listening happen without trying to harvest meaning from every moment. This was the difference, Eleanor realized. Between spiritual productivity and soul flowing, one demanded results, The other simply received what came. The understanding arrived during week 8 of her 347 awakening. Eleanor was sitting with her tea, watching frost form on the window. When the insight crystallized, God wakes women after 50, because that's when we finally have the capacity to hear Him. Before 50, the noise was too loud. Children needing lunch money. Husbands needing attention. Careers needing building. Parents beginning their decline. The sacred got squeezed into Sunday mornings and crisis moments, scattered between soccer games and mammograms. But now, the house empty of children's chaos. The career ladder no longer demanding to be climbed. The mirror reflecting a face that had stopped trying to be 35. Now there was space. And into that space, at 3:47 a.m., came invitations younger women couldn't have accepted. Eleanor discovered something fascinating. Cortisol naturally spikes at 3 to 4 a.m. in women over 50. But why precisely 3:47? That's where medicine ends and mystery begins. She thought of her mother's friends, the church ladies she'd once considered quaintly religious. How many of them had discovered this secret schedule? How many had been initiated into the 347 Club without ever speaking of it, carrying their night watches like hidden pearls? This wasn't about being holier or more spiritual. It was about finally having the emotional real estate to host the divine. After 50, women had wrestled enough demons to recognize angels, had lost enough to understand surrender, had carried enough to appreciate being carried. Week 10 brought the transformation Eleanor couldn't have imagined. The clock struck 3:47, her eyes opened, and instead of dread flooding her system, peace. Not the fragile peace of positive thinking, but something substantial, architectural, built from 2 months of midnight surrenders. Her body had rewired itself. Where adrenaline once spiked, calm now pooled. Where her chest used to tighten, breath now deepened automatically. The very neurons that had fired in panic patterns had found new pathways, carved by repetition and trust. She tested it, waiting for the familiar anxiety to ambush her. But it never came. The darkness that had felt suffocating now felt spacious as a cathedral nave. Her heartbeat, once erratic as a broken metronome, kept steady time with something infinite. Eleanor remembered her mother's final days, how morphine had lifted the pain but also the fear, leaving something luminous in its wake. This felt similar, but achieved without medicine, just the slow patient work of accepting what she couldn't change and receiving what she hadn't requested. The shift was so complete that when her daughter called, worried about her mother's insomnia, Eleanor found herself laughing. "Honey, I'm not suffering from wakefulness anymore. I'm apprenticing to it." Peace at 3:47 a.m. Who would have imagined such a thing possible? Eleanor's prayers evolved into something she wouldn't have recognized 3 months ago. No more rehearsed phrases or formal addresses to the ceiling. At 3:47, prayer became presence, pure and simple. She'd sit in her mother's old rocking chair, the one that creaked in B-flat, and rock in rhythm with something ancient. Her lips didn't move, her mind didn't construct sentences, but her entire being prayed. Every cell seemed to turn toward the divine, like sunflowers following light. Sometimes tears came, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of not having to explain herself. God already knew about the guilt over her mother's final moments, the fear of irrelevance, the secret relief that caregiving was over. At 3:47, pretense was pointless. The prayer without words went deeper than language could reach. It touched the place where her soul connected to its source, that junction point where human met holy. She understood now why mystics went silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they'd found something beyond saying. Her breath became the prayer. In and out, receiving and releasing, held and holding. 20 minutes would pass like 2 heartbeats, and Eleanor would return to herself changed in ways she couldn't articulate but felt in her bones. This was intimacy beyond what she'd known in marriage, friendship, or motherhood. This was communion at its source. Eleanor began to notice the tenderness in the timing. Not 2 a.m. when the darkness felt oppressive. Not 5 a.m. when the day's demands began stirring. But 3:47, That perfect pause between yesterday's exhaustion and tomorrow's obligations. God wasn't a drill sergeant, she realized, shocking her awake for spiritual boot camp. He was more like the mother she'd been, knowing exactly when to slip into a child's room, after the nightmare settled, but before deep sleep made waking cruel. The precision felt personal now, as if the divine knew her specific circadian rhythm, her unique threshold between rest and receptivity. He'd waited through her years of busy resistance, through decades of daytime noise, for this exact season when she could receive the gift disguised as disruption. She thought of Peter, James, and John in Gethsemane, asked to stay awake but falling asleep instead. Jesus hadn't condemned their exhaustion, only noted their willing spirits housed in weak flesh. Now, at 58, Eleanor's flesh was finally weak enough to let her spirit lead. The gentleness undid her. This wasn't the demanding God of her childhood imagination, requiring sacrifice and sleeplessness. This was the God who knew she needed exactly 7 minutes to fully wake, who gave her time to find her robe, who waited while she made tea. 347 wasn't random. It was customized. The journey mapped itself in Eleanor's journal. Week 1. Why is this happening to me? Week 5. What are you trying to tell me? Week 12. Thank you for waking me. Trust hadn't arrived suddenly like switching on a light. It had grown slowly, like learning to walk after surgery, first gripping the bed rails, then shuffling with a walker, finally stepping free. Each 347 awakening had been a physical therapy session for her soul. She could track the progression in her body. The clenched jaw that had gradually softened, the shoulders that had dropped from ears to their proper position, the breathing that had shifted from shallow panic to deep surrender. Trust, it turned out, was muscular, built through repetition, strengthened by practice. Eleanor thought of her mother's final weeks, how she'd moved from fighting death to curious acceptance. I want to see what's next, she'd whispered near the end. Now Eleanor understood that curiosity. Not morbid, but holy, the recognition that what felt like ending might be beginning. At 347, she no longer asked why, but what. What would tonight's waking bring? What whisper would find her in the darkness? What part of her needed to die so something else could live? Trust had replaced fear so gradually she'd barely noticed the renovation of her inner landscape. The transformation completed itself on an ordinary Thursday. Eleanor woke at 347, and her first thought was, "Hello, friend." The hour she'd dreaded had become sacred. Her bedroom had transformed from prison to sanctuary. The green glow of the clock no longer felt like judgment, but like vigil candle, marking holy time. Eleanor Googled 347 biblical meaning and gasped. Psalm 34-7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. The numbers weren't random, they were a divine zip code. She rose with anticipation now, the way she used to rise for Christmas morning as a child. What would this divine appointment hold? Sometimes profound revelation, sometimes simple silence, always the assurance that she was held, known, accompanied. 347 had become her spiritual address. While her small Iowa town slept, she was awake in a timeless place where heaven touched earth through the membrane of darkness. She'd joined an invisible congregation of night watchers, all discovering that God's office hours included the graveyard shift. Eleanor set out 2 teacups now, one for her, one for the presence. She knew it was whimsical, possibly sacrilegious, but it felt right. The second cup sat empty but somehow full, a placeholder for the guest who never failed to arrive. When friends complained about their insomnia, Eleanor stayed quiet. How could she explain that her sleep disorder had become her spiritual discipline? That 347 wasn't taking something from her but giving her everything. Holy disruption. Sacred inconvenience. Blessed interruption. 347 had become the hour of her soul's resurrection. Eleanor's 347 awakening had become a bridge. What started in darkness now carried her toward dawn. Those precious 90 minutes between wake and light becoming her soul's workshop. She noticed the progression. 347 brought the awakening. 4 o'clock brought the settling. 4:30 brought the deepening. And by 5 o'clock, when the first birds began their tentative songs, She was ready to meet the day from a completely different place. The journey from 3:47 to 5 a.m. had its own rhythm. Like climbing a mountain in darkness, each phase revealed new vistas. The fear that lived at 3:47 softened into curiosity by 4:15. The questions that churned at 4 o'clock settled into acceptance by 4:45, and when 5 o'clock arrived with its promise of light, Eleanor was already illuminated from within. She'd become intimate with these liminal hours, knew their textures and temperatures. 3:47 was velvet dark, thick with possibility. 4:30 was silver gray, like looking through water. 5 o'clock was pearl and promise, the world holding its breath before rebirth. This journey repeated nightly, yet never felt repetitive. Each passage from dark to light was both ancient ritual and fresh discovery. Eleanor was learning to midwife her own daily resurrection, guided by the friend who kept faithful watch. 3 months into her night watches, Eleanor understood why she'd been awakened. Not for generic prayer or vague spirituality, but for specific purpose that could only be discovered in darkness. The clarity came gradually. First, the knowing that her caregiving years hadn't ended but transformed. She was still meant to tend to others, but from a different place, not from exhaustion and obligation, but from overflow and invitation. The 3:47 awakening was filling her with something meant to be poured out. She began to see the other women. At the grocery store, in the church parking lot, at the library. Women her age, with that particular exhaustion in their eyes, that look of being spent without being renewed. Women grinding through their days, pushing through their nights, never finding the rhythm that had been waiting for them all along. Eleanor's purpose crystallized. She was being prepared to teach what she'd learned, not through programs or presentations, but through presence. Through being living proof that exhaustion wasn't the only option for women who'd spent themselves caring for others. The morning routine with God she'd discovered wasn't just personal renovation, it was preparation for ministry. Every 3:47 awakening was training for something larger than her own transformation. Purpose had been hiding in what looked like disruption. God hadn't stolen her sleep, he'd given her a mission. Eleanor's days transformed as profoundly as her nights. The soul flowing she'd discovered at 3:47 began to permeate everything. How she moved through grocery aisles, answered emails, even how she breathed. She noticed the difference when her daughter visited, frantic with her own juggling act of career and twin toddlers. Eleanor watched her grinding through the day, forcing nap time, wrestling with car seats, battling bedtime like it was combat. The old Eleanor would have jumped in, adding her own force to the struggle. Instead, she demonstrated something different. When the twins resisted lunch, Eleanor began singing softly, letting rhythm replace rules. When nap time became battlefield, she suggested they all just rest together, no agenda. Her daughter watched, mystified, as the boys settled into Eleanor's flowing energy like boats finding harbor. "How are you so calm?" her daughter asked, exhausted tears threatening. Eleanor wanted to explain about 3:47, about the friend who taught her that resistance created turbulence while surrender created flow. Instead, she simply said, "I learned to stop fighting the current." She saw her daughter's skepticism, the same skepticism Eleanor would have felt 3 months ago. But seeds were being planted. Sometimes the only way to teach soul flowing was to embody it, to be the river that shows others water doesn't have to crash against rocks. The revelation arrived on night 91, so simple Eleanor laughed out loud in the darkness. God hadn't been disturbing her rest, he'd been trying to teach her what rest actually was. For 58 years, she'd confused sleep with rest, thought unconsciousness was the only break from the grinding. But real rest, she discovered, had nothing to do with being asleep, and everything to do with being aligned. Those 3:47 awakenings weren't theft, but gift. God was showing her that rest could exist in full consciousness, that peace wasn't dependent on REM cycles. She could be completely awake and completely at rest simultaneously, a paradox her grinding self could never have comprehended. Eleanor thought of Jesus sleeping through the storm, then thought deeper. He wasn't at rest because he was sleeping. He could sleep because he was at rest. The disciples' panic wasn't about the storm, but about their disconnection from the peace that passes understanding. Now, even in daylight's demands, Eleanor carried 347's rest with her. Standing in line at the DMV, sitting in traffic, waiting for test results, she could access that quality of rest that had nothing to do with external circumstances. God had used insomnia to cure her of something far worse than sleeplessness, the chronic exhaustion of trying to power through life without divine rhythm. The final piece clicked into place as Eleanor sat in her 347 sanctuary, spring rain pattering against windows. This hadn't been about prayer or productivity or even peace. God had been calling her deeper, past the shallows where she'd spent 5 decades, into the depths where her soul could finally swim free. The shallows had felt safe, predictable depths where her feet could touch bottom, where she could manage the waves. But souls weren't meant for waiting. They were designed for oceanic depths, for mysteries that couldn't be managed or measured. At 347, God had been calling her past the breakers of her own limitations, past the fear of being unnecessary, past the addiction to being needed, past the grinding productivity that masqueraded as purpose. Into the deep, where she couldn't stand, couldn't control, could only float in trust. Eleanor understood now why it had taken 58 years to hear this call. Younger, she would have tried to swim back to shore, terrified of the depth. But now, having buried parents, raised children, survived her own various deaths, she had the spiritual buoyancy to surrender to deep water. Deeper still, she whispered to the darkness, and felt herself releasing the last grip on the shore of her old life. This was what soul flowing truly meant, not just moving with the current, but trusting the depths. It started accidentally. Eleanor mentioned her 347 awakening to Linda at coffee, just a casual comment about finding peace in unexpected places. Linda's eyes widened. You too? I've been awake at 4:15 every night for months. Thought I was losing my mind. Within weeks, they'd found 5 others. Martha with her 2:30 wake-ups, Grace at 3:15, Patricia at 4:45. Each woman had been wrestling alone with what they thought was disorder, never imagining it might be divine appointment. They began meeting at 5 a.m. on Thursdays, gathering in Eleanor's kitchen as dawn broke. No agenda, no structure, just 7 women who'd discovered that God kept night office hours. They called themselves the 5 a.m. Sisters, though their wake times varied like instruments in an orchestra. Within 3 months, their Facebook group 347 a.m. Divine Awakening had 12,000 members. Women from Seoul to São Paulo, all waking at the same precise moment, crossing time zones. The conversations were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in traditional Bible study. These women had been stripped down to essence by their night watches. Pretense had been burned away at 3 a.m., leaving only truth. They spoke of marriages that looked perfect but felt empty, of children who'd become strangers, of the terror of irrelevance after retirement. But mostly, they spoke of the transformation. How insomnia had become invitation. How disruption had become discipline. How what seemed like punishment had revealed itself as privilege. 7 women, discovering together that Christian women over 50 weren't being abandoned by sleep, but recruited for something holy. Eleanor stood at her window on the 6-month anniversary of her first 347 awakening, watching her small Iowa town wake beneath a rose-gold sunrise. The woman who'd gripped her sheets in terror seemed like someone she'd known in another lifetime. Soul flowing wasn't a technique she'd mastered, it was a way of being she'd surrendered into. The difference between grinding and flowing wasn't about working harder or praying longer. It was about recognizing when you were moving with divine current instead of against it. She thought of the women discovering this truth across the country, maybe the world. Women waking at their appointed hours, initially frightened, gradually recognizing the invitation hidden in the disruption, each finding her own path from grinding to flowing, from resistance to reception. The 5 a.m. sisters had grown to 12, then 20, meeting in small groups throughout the week. They'd discovered that finding purpose after 50 wasn't about creating new obligations but about flowing with what was already moving. Their morning routine with God didn't follow anyone's template. Each woman's practice was as unique as her wake time. Eleanor lifted her teacup in a toast to the clock that still glowed 3:47 each night. What had seemed like affliction had become her greatest teacher. The soul flowing she'd discovered wasn't just about spiritual growth after 50. It was about learning that the soul had always known how to flow. It just took divine interruption to stop the grinding long enough to remember. Your 3:47 a.m. awakening, or whatever precise time pulls you from sleep, isn't a problem to be solved. It's an invitation to be accepted. Tonight, place a notebook by your bed. Title it 347 Messages. When you wake, and you will wake, write just 3 words that come to you. Within a week, you'll see the pattern. Within a month, you'll understand the calling. Right now, across the world, women are discovering what Eleanor learned in those dark morning hours, that God uses disruption as doorway, insomnia as invitation, and what seems like punishment as profound privilege. The exhaustion you've been fighting might be the very thing trying to teach you the difference between grinding and flowing. Soul flowing begins the moment you stop fighting divine timing. It's not about forcing yourself to pray at 3:47 a.m. or creating another rigid spiritual discipline. It's about recognizing that your soul already knows how to flow. It's just been waiting for you to stop grinding long enough to feel the current. If you've been waking at strange hours, if you're a woman over 50 wondering why sleep has abandoned you, if you're exhausted from grinding through your days and wrestling through your nights, consider this. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're being broken open. Maybe that precise wake time isn't random but customized. Not disruption, but invitation. The 5 a.m. sisters are growing. Women everywhere are discovering that their morning routine with God doesn't start with alarm clocks but with divine awakening. They're learning that spiritual growth after 50 looks different than any book or program promised. It looks like surrender at 3:47 a.m. Tonight, when you wake at your appointed hour, remember Eleanor's journey. Remember that fear can transform into trust, that disruption can become discipline, that what seems like darkness might be the cathedral where your soul learns to flow. This is soul flowing, and it might just begin tonight at 3:47.